Thank you so much, and what a treat to be here. Now, almost everywhere you turn at the moment, you will see, hear, read discussions about whether we should be getting our children off social media and off phones. Much of it, of course, driven by this man. His book, The Anxious Generation, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for the past 4 weeks. He argues that a whole generation has been damaged by growing up with unrestricted access to social media and to an adult online world, but also by being so overprotected and overparented that it's a generation of young adults unable to cope with the rigors of normal life. His book, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness, may be doing so well because he is tapping into something in society, a concern, a very widely held belief among parents that there is something going wrong. He is very much the man of the moment. He is, of course, Jonathan Haidt. Now, Jonathan, I mean, the response in the room when you walk on stage, it's just an illustration in a way of what you're tapping into. But I was astonished to read that actually you didn't intend to read this book. I mean, of course you had, Hannah mentioned the righteous mind, you had the happiness hypothesis, you had the coddling of the American mind. It didn't come out of anywhere, but you set out to write a different book, didn't you?
That's right. Yes, I did. But I first just want to say just what a pleasure it is for an American to come to Britain and to be able to speak, to be hosted in a room like this, because we have rooms like this in America, but they were all built about 100 years ago as copies of this. And in so many ways, coming to Britain is kind of like seeing the Platonic forms of the things we have copies of in America in a lot of ways. Not just our architecture, but our political institutions as well. And so to get such a warm welcome in such a space, so thank you. Now to answer your question, yes, I actually set out to write 2 other books that haven't been written because I wrote this one. So in 2015, I got a contract to write a book called 3 Stories About Capitalism, The Moral Psychology of Economic Life. I had recently moved to a business school, to the NYU Stern, and I thought I would continue The Righteous Mind, which was about social left-right, and let's do economic left-right. Got a contract for that, went to Asia for a semester, did a lot of research, came back, published the Coddling the American Mind article, thought I'd go back to work on the capitalism book, and then our universities blew up in 2015. And that was such a change of my home institution. I've been focused on that. What the hell happened? Why are we now all afraid? We're afraid of our students, we're afraid to speak, we're afraid of social punishments for expressing ideas. So that led me to work with Greg Lukianoff to spend the whole time writing this other book, The Coddling the American Mind. And then I had a sabbatical in 2020. I said, okay, now I'll get back to the capitalism book. But my country was blowing up and dividing, and things were just getting weirder and worse. And I kept having ideas for why. It has something to do with social media. Something's changed about the way we're all connected. And so then I had the idea to write 8 essays for The Atlantic on like 8 different reasons why everything is going to hell. And the editor of The Atlantic said, don't write 8, write 1. And so I wrote 1, which was titled ultimately, Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid. So that was my first, and it's gotten much worse since then. So that was my first pass at what then became a book contract of, this really should be a book. And that book is going to be called Life After Babel, Adapting to a World We May Never Again Share. And I got the contract to write that book. So I have 2, they give me a lot of money here to write 2 books that I still haven't written. And I started writing that book, and chapter 1 was going to be what happened to teenagers when they moved their lives online. Because I'd done all this research on teen mental health, but that was a side project. I study moral and political psychology, but I have this side project on what's happening to Gen Z. And I had all this data, and the story was really becoming clear. So, okay, chapter 1, we're going to show how when teenagers moved onto social media around 2012, almost instantly they became depressed and anxious. And then the rest of the book is about what happens to democracy when your public life moves onto social media. But by the time I finished that first chapter, and you'll see the graphs in it, They're absolutely unbelievable. It was like someone flipped a switch in 2012 and all the rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, they go shooting up, especially for girls. And I realized I can't just like drop this and say, all right, now let's move on. Once I wrote that chapter, I had to write another chapter on explaining, how did this happen and what is childhood? And then I had to have a chapter on girls because that's a special story. And then I have to have a chapter on boys. And so by the time I had 4 chapters, I realized I'm never going to finish this book. It's going to be gigantic. I need to cut the book in half. So I got a contract for another book. So I have 3 book contracts, and now I actually have written one of them. So that's where we are.
Okay. Well, let's try and unpick that very first chapter, which is the scale of the problem, which you write this chapter and you realize. I mean, there are some terrifying graphs in there. The best way to illustrate the scale of the problem, how would you set it out?
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the harms first.
Yes, okay, let's talk about the harms. So when we track, in the UK and the US, we have very good long-running studies, better than most parts of the world. And so you can track how rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm, those are the clearest ones. The central problem is anxiety. And it's related to depression, that's related to self-harm. So let's focus on those 3. From the 90s through the 2000s, we're talking the millennial generation, which many of you in this room are. If you're born between 1981 and 1995, you're a millennial. Your mental health was actually fine, a little better than Gen X before you. So all the numbers are going along, they go up, down, up, sort of moving along. And then all of a sudden, those numbers all start rising right around 2012, 2013. And the level of the rise, especially for boys, it's a little slower. It's not such a sharp elbow. That's a different story. But for girls, it's a very sharp elbow. And when we look at the younger teen girls, ages 10 to 14, that's where we see the hugest rises. So those younger girls, they didn't used to be hospitalized for self-harm. That was very, very rare. But after 2012, the numbers go way up. For the older teen girls, I think it's like 70 or 80% increase. For the younger teen girls, it's more like 150. That's in America. In Britain, you have data that 10 to 12-year-old girls are up 380% increase. It's more than a quadruple.
For self-harming.
For self-harm, that's right. So something happened that especially, when girls got super connected and began sharing, the idea of self-harming and the idea of anxiety became just much more widespread.
Okay, now there is definitely something going on which is to do with people being more open and more likely to report. And there will be plenty of people, old people, who will say, look, I self-harmed when I was in my teens.
Oh, I see.
Can you strip out that factor, the fact that people are more likely to come forward?
Yes. So there are a couple of critiques that I get. One of them, the important null hypothesis, is nothing's going on, the kids are all right. This is just changes in their willingness to report and changes in diagnostic criteria. Concept creep, we consider smaller things to be problematic now. Perfectly reasonable hypothesis. But the fact that the behavior curves match the self-report curves, so the curves for self-harm match the self-report. Now you're saying even self-harm could be, sure, there could be generational differences, but why would it be between 2012 and 2013? Why would it suddenly change that year in America, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Northern Europe? You can't explain why it changes everywhere at the same time.
And hospitalizations went up.
And these are hospitalizations, like psychiatric emergency department visits.
Okay. There's something else going on with suicide, isn't there? Because in girls, I don't think suicide's gone up, but in boys it has.
Now hold on. In the US, it's up a lot for both boys and girls. And the increase percentage-wise is actually fairly similar. Boys have a higher rate because when boys make attempts, they don't make as many attempts, but they tend to use irreversible means. They tend to use a gun in my country or a tall building. So boys have much higher rates, about 3 times the rate. They both are way up. It starts a little bit earlier than 2012. The suicide rate begins going up a couple years earlier. But both sexes are up a lot in America. Now then I'm in a debate with people who say, suicide is declining around the world, which is true. Suicide rates have been going down since the early 2000s. That's great. But if you break it out by age and sex, you see all these different groups going slightly down, down, down for 20 years. And then right around 2014, you see one line going way up. And this is a graph you can find in The Economist. It's the teen girls, even though the world's going down, teen girls suddenly start going way up, and a little later teen boys go up somewhat. So in Britain, so what you should look at is whatever the rate is, if you zoom in on your younger teen girls, you'll see they're much worse off than everyone else.
Okay, so you are now talking 2012, 2013, 2014, something happened. Now I know you are convinced about what it is. What would you posit is the cause behind this?
So the cause behind it is that we changed childhood more radically than it has ever been changed in just a few years. I mean, the change from agriculture to the Industrial Revolution, that was a pretty radical change, but that was over 100 years, whatever you want to say. So what I want you to do is those of you who had children or those of you who were children in 2010, what was your technology life like? You had a flip phone, your phone, you had to press the 7 key 3 times to make the letter S. Some of you remember that? Okay. So did you spend all day typing about your feelings with your friends? No. You say, see you at 3, you meet up. So technology for millennials was a tool that they could use to improve their social lives. They might have had Facebook, which they used on their parents' computer. You couldn't use it on a phone. So there was Facebook, there were cell phones, but you were not spending 5 hours a day on social media or on your phone. Also, your phone didn't have a front-facing camera. Also, you had to pay for text. Also, you didn't have high-speed internet. So all the way up to 2010, children had what we might recognize as a human childhood. But between 2010 and 2015, the technology changes such that by 2015, almost everybody, you can see this very sharp adoption curves. By 2015, almost all teens now, they've traded in their flip phones for a smartphone with a front-facing camera, unlimited data, and Instagram or Tumblr or other social media platforms. Now, the boys and the girls all rush on. The boys go for video games and YouTube especially. The girls go much more for visually oriented social media, so Instagram, Tumblr, Pinterest. So what is a boy's life? A boy's life is more video games, which are not particularly harmful, but we'll get back to that, I hope, because it ends up taking them out of life. The girls, on the other hand, their life now revolves around photographs, ratings of photographs, what people are saying about the photographs, why someone like. So the girls, you take all the worst parts of being a teenage girl, and then you multiply them by 10 because now all of that is magnified, the bullying, the social comparison. So that's why I'm calling 2010 to 2015 the great rewiring of childhood. What childhood now is in our countries and in most of the developed world, if you're a boy, you're sitting at a video game console because you can't go to your friend's house. If you go over to a friend's house, you can't play video games. You have to go home alone. So you can put on your headset, your video game controller. So boys are sitting alone playing video games. Girls are sitting alone. They might be next to another girl, but they're sitting alone. They're on social media. So this is not a human childhood. This is, if you remember the opening scene or that key scene in The Matrix, where you see suddenly the Matrix is revealed and you see all the people lying in pods with something sucking out their brain juice. That's kind of what happened.
So, Jonathan, the graphs are amazing. And in a way, they look like, gosh, they match. Look what's happening at that point. Look what's happening to...
Across countries.
So you have a correlation. But the charge that you will know that is often leveled against you is it doesn't necessarily mean that you have causation.
That's right.
And in a way, I don't know, perhaps you would argue, perhaps you can't. I don't know how one would ever prove, because you can't sort of take the group of people that aren't on social media who've never self-harmed. But that is a particular challenge for what you're positing, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, but it's one that I've been addressing since 2019. So, as everyone knows in the social sciences, correlation doesn't prove causation. There are consistent correlations in which heavy users of social media are 2 or 3 times more likely to be depressed. And you might say, oh, well, maybe depressed people just like to use more social media. And that could be true. And so that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. So we have to move on and look at longitudinal studies where you track people over time, and does an increase at time 1 cause an increase in time 2? That gets you closer to causality, but it's not proof of causality. And then the real gold standard is experiments. So what I've been doing since 2019 is collecting all the studies I can find on all sides. I don't want to be accused of cherry picking. I want to say, let's take everything, because it's so confusing. There's so many studies. People point to this study, that study. Let's put them all together in Google Docs, invite the world to comment on them. So I've been incredibly transparent, doing this since 2019 with Jean Twenge. So in one of our Google Docs, we have 150 studies, mostly correlational, that's true. But we have, I think, 25 experiments and 8 quasi-experiments, which are a different category of experiment. And they don't all show an effect, but the great majority of them do. And that's the way the game is played. If you have the experiments, then that is evidence of causation. Now we can argue about the quality of the experiments, and that's where we are. So those who say I have no evidence and I'm mistaking correlation for causation simply haven't read my work. Because from the very beginning, I've been very clear. I have many writings on this about how do we tease out causality. So we're in a debate, but I believe I've shown causality.
Okay, and to be very clear, throughout the book, you keep flagging up that there is going to be an online version that you will update as more information comes out.
Yeah.
But you do appear to, I think you're pretty open about it, you set out to prove something. And reading it, I was thinking, there are positive experiences. The boy that you mentioned sitting on, who goes home alone on playing video games, he's chatting to his friends on the headphones.
That's right.
The girl, there might be a girl who is struggling to make friends at school, but she'll find somebody online who she can connect to and realize she's not alone. And there is no representation of the positive side of social media in your book.
Actually, I do have a short section called On the Benefits of Social Media. But maybe you've actually read it, or maybe you just know what's coming. And I talk about that, the pluses and minuses school, which is, people say, well, there's these pluses, there's these minuses, and the pluses are, really the only real evidence they point to is, kids say that it makes them feel closer to their friends. And that's true. But does that mean it's actually good? Imagine this situation. You take kids who are playing with each other every day, they're getting together, they have clubs, they do this, they do that, and you say, hey kids, come each to your individual cell. We've got amazing stuff for you in your individual cell. You're all alone in your individual cell. Now, here's a tin can with a string. You can use it to talk to your friends. And then you do that for a few years, and then someone comes along and says, how do you feel about your tin can? Oh, I love it. It makes me feel closer to my friends. So the mere fact that they say it makes them feel closer does not mean that it's been good for them, because as soon as the girls moved onto social media, they began saying they were much lonelier, their lives felt pointless, and they were more depressed. When the boys moved on to multiplayer video games, which is more like around 2007, 8, 9, as internet speeds are picking up, that's why the boys' curve, I believe, starts earlier. It's not as sharp at 2012. The boys, when they move their social life much more onto multiplayer video games, they become more lonely, more depressed, and they too say their lives are pointless, there's no purpose, I feel useless. So sure, you can say they say they like it, but I think the evidence is pretty clear. If these things were good for them, we'd have seen an increase in well-being in the early 2000s, not a collapse.
Okay. I'm going to keep pushing on
Please.
this, because the
harder you push, the better I get.
Most children, most parents I know, or at least let's put it, most children don't have unrestricted use. They might not be allowed to have their phone in their bedroom, they might be limited by their parents. You paint a picture of this sort of unrestricted, uncontrolled hours on, and there are cases like that, but they are at just one end of the spectrum. So the challenge, this challenge to you is on whether you're being fair, to the actual use.
So there are big demographic differences. I don't have the data for the UK, but I can tell you in the US, if you just look at hours of time on their phones, if you have 2 college-educated parents who are married, it's something like 7 hours a day. But if you're white or I think Asian. But if you're black or Hispanic or have a single parent or are low social class, it's a couple hours higher. The phone, the iPad it's an incredibly effective pacifier. It turns out now it's really more like giving your kid morphine to shut him up. But it's true that many kids have tight restrictions. But talk to parents. Okay, look, parents in the room, raise your hand if you were a parent of a kid over the age, between 8 and 22. Raise your hand. Okay, just you in the audience, just you who raised your hands. How many of you felt like it was pretty easy to control? We were able to keep a lid on it. We were able to raise our kids the way we wanted. Raise your hand high.
It was easy to control.
1, 2, 3.
4,
Parents,
5.
Okay, 5 or
6.
All right, but less than 10%, less than 5%.
We haven't even gone up there.
For those of you watching on the video, it was about, I'd say, 5 to 7% of the people that raised their hands said that. We're all really trying, and we're failing. And unless you're willing to put on spy software and watch over your kids' shoulders and monitor them, oh, and by the way, if they go to a friend's house, they can just use a browser there. Okay. So at present, there is almost no way for parents to raise their kids the way they want because the tech companies have put us in a trap where if we do what we think is right, we're isolating our kid. You know, I mean, Apple gives us good screen time controls. There are tools out there. But, you know, we're trying, and most of us are failing.
Okay, we're going to come on to solutions with regard to tech companies a bit. I just want to just nail something, of course. You talked there about going on a browser. Your complaint isn't with the internet.
No, I love the internet.
Okay, and it's not with children being on the internet unless they're on adult areas. It's mainly social media is the target.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
can I just demonstrate that with this audience?
Yeah.
I can show you. This is a very important distinction because I often hear this. Oh, you know, without social media, kids would have been so isolated during COVID. Oh, thank God they had social media. All right, let me thought experiment for you. So imagine that it's the early 90s, and a genie comes to you with 3 glowing, floating boxes, magical boxes, and the genie says to you, you can open 0, 1, 2, or 3 of these boxes. If you open it, it's going to take 15 hours a week of your life. Here's the first box, and he opens it. It's the internet. You will have omniscience. You will be able to know everything instantly. Now, it's going to take 15 hours a week. Do you want it? Raise your hand if you're glad we opened the box. You're glad we have the internet. Raise your hand high. Okay, the great majority, it's not all of you, but it's the great majority. Okay, so great, we've got the internet. And remember, the early 90s was amazing. And, you know, we thought it was going to save democracy and mental health was fine. Okay, now let's move up. Now let's move up. And the second box, he opens it, and it's the iPhone. It's this incredible digital Swiss Army knife, which can do all these functions. You know, you used to have to buy a radio and a flashlight and a map, and no, everything is in this one thing. But remember, you have the internet and the iPhone, so now you're up to 30 hours a week you're going to be spending on these two. Raise your hand if you're glad that we opened that box. You're glad we have smartphones. Raise your hand high. Okay, now it's maybe around half, maybe a little less than half, but it's still a lot of people. Okay, and now the third box, he opens it, it's social media. You already have the whole internet and you have your smartphone. Do you also want to have social media where you get to post stuff and comment on people's stuff and get sucked into spending many hours a day doing that? I'm sorry, I shouldn't bias the survey. But honestly, I mean, you know, if you already have the internet and an iPhone, how many of you are glad we opened the social media box? The world's a better place because we have Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, etc. Raise your hand high if you think it was good that we opened it. 1, 2, 3, 4, so probably about a dozen. So this is my point. Technology is amazing. Technology is the way we've advanced for many thousands of years. The internet is incredible. We can't imagine life without the internet. The internet has so many benefits. Social media is an entirely different animal, engineered to hack into young people's insecurities about their position in society and keep pressing on it to keep them paying attention. I don't think that's a good deal.
Now, the headlines have largely been about the sort of banning of social media or restricting.
Yeah, you British, you just love to ban things. I'm not talking about banning. Like, every conversation is about banning phones.
What do you want then?
I want norms.
Okay.
I want to change norms.
You want to ban? We'll come back to this. We'll come back to this. But just on those specific things, let me put this: banning phones from schools during the school day.
Yeah, that I do want. Yes.
And restricting social media to over 16s. Mm-hmm. Okay. But
yes,
there is the second half of your book is actually about a whole other aspect, which is that while children, this generation, are on their phones, they are not doing things in real life. And you have suggested that both that combination of phones and not doing other things in real life is deprived them of their childhood. Just talk about the importance of what you think they're missing.
Sure. So humans have these gigantic brains. So within any group of animals, if there's some that have gigantic brains, it's going to be because they're super social. And so among the primates, we're the huge brain champions because we're super duper social, much more than chimpanzees. We're ultra social. Well, and in humans, part of our sociality is culture. We developed culture, and it was when we developed culture, we developed culture, and culture requires a much longer childhood. This seems to be the explanation for why we have this unique growth pattern, which is human children grow quickly, and then we slow down after 2 or 3 years, and then we grow very slowly, from like 5 to 10, growing very slowly. All other primates, they just grow and grow and grow until they can reproduce, and then they reproduce. Why do we have this long, slow period? It's because our brains need to wire up. They need a lot of cultural training from either older kids or older people. We're guided all around the world. We're guided, especially at puberty, we're guided through how do you make the transition from a girl to a woman or a boy to a man. So humans have this incredible developmental process that we've evolved to have. And like all mammals, play is the main way we do it, especially early on. We play at roles. We play at roles that we'll have as adults within our gender. So play is an intrinsic part, a crucial part of life. If you deprive animals, including children, of play, they come out anxious and socially unskilled, which is what most people say about Gen Z on average. So when you deprive young mammals of what they most need, you're blocking human development. And my argument is that between 2010 and 2015, we blocked human development at a level never before seen in human history. Imagine, for those of you who are older, those of you who are born before 1995, or especially before 1981, let's talk Gen X and older, think back on your childhood. Think back on all the things you did, all the adventures. Now imagine removing 70% of the time hanging out with friends. At least 70%. Just imagine you didn't have that. That was gone. Imagine you had any hobbies that you had. If you did something physical, imagine that's gone. Imagine thrills, adventures where you might have gotten hurt. 80% of that's gone. And in its place, you have vast amounts of content you're consuming, short videos, 20-second videos, TikTok videos, after a few hours of which you might stop and then you say, what did I just do for the last 3 hours, is what people say to me. So what I'm saying is, let's imagine almost all the good stuff from childhood, take out 70% of it, and now imagine growing up with just the remaining 30%. And that's what we've done to Gen Z.
Okay,
so
now one of the things that you say, that you set out in the book, is that there's a particularly risky form of play that is important, which I think the word you use is anti-fragile. The example is a tree needs wind as it's growing in order to become stronger. Right. And this is what you suggest, which I suppose is the coddling of childhood from earlier. But which you think has been replaced by people sitting by, actually not even necessarily being on their phones, by their parents saying, you can't walk home from school, you can't climb that tree, you can't go to that. And that is doing as much damage as phones, or doing a considerable...
Yeah. So there's two parts to the story. And let me just mention that the thrill part is something which is really important and really interesting. So there's a number of play researchers have pointed out that kids, when they're naturally playing, they will, if they master something, they'll make it more dangerous. If they learn to skateboard down a hill, they'll then go for a really steep hill. Then they'll go for a jump. Then they'll go downstairs. And they're going to fall. They're going to hurt themselves. Why do they do this? Why would you choose to hurt yourself? If you learn to swing, you're going to jump off the swings, and you're going to go higher and higher, and you might hurt yourself. You're not going to kill yourself, but you might hurt yourself. Why do kids try to hurt themselves? Well, they're not trying to hurt themselves directly. They're seeking out just the right level of thrill, and thrill requires fear, the fear of actually getting hurt. And it turns out kids need this. This is how we overcome childhood fears. I have a great little story in the book about my dog. While I was writing this, got a puppy named Wilma, and I have a video, and you can find at anxiousgeneration.com. I just put it up. Wilma was this little tiny thing. She was 7 pounds when we got her, and I took her to Washington Square Park near where I live, and there was a German Shepherd in an area where dogs run. There was a big German Shepherd, and I let Wilma off the leash, which was probably foolish at that age, because she might have run away. But anyway, so Wilma goes going up to the dog, and then as soon as the dog makes a motion, she goes running away. Now you might think she's terrified. She's going to run home. No. She was afraid, but she was also intrigued, and she was thrilled. She goes running away, comes to me, runs around me, and runs right back to the dog. And then the dog moves again. So she's playing this game. She's trying to adjust the level of fear after it, and then she runs away and she comes back for more. She's dosing herself with fear. And that's how you become fearless. And that's what kids do. When you're climbing a tree and you're a little scared, you go a little higher, and then you did it. And now you're not as afraid of climbing trees. So anyway, my point is, as we began to focus on physical safety and then emotional safety, we said, let's not let our kids do anything that could be dangerous. Nothing that could be dangerous. We have to watch them or they'll do something dangerous. And in doing so, it's as though we said, how about if we don't let them have anything with vitamin C? No vitamin C. And then, of course, they get scurvy. So we have to recognize that kids are seeking out the right level of fear. And I just want to point out about video games, yeah, they look like great fun. I watch my son play Fortnite. He's jumping out of planes, he's having knife fights, they're killing people, they're competing, it's very exciting. Is he ever afraid? Is there a moment of fear? No, there's no fear. Boys are not getting anything from video games that will help turn them into men.